Hi, I'm Blake Hollaway, and welcome to the Jotted Journal podcast, a series of stories written and read by me. Today I'm reading The Monsters We Know. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that are human. Take a seat, get comfortable, and let me take you to another world. Warning. This podcast episode discusses difficult topics surrounding sexual violence. Listener's discretion is advised. Stephen's house was larger than most in the neighborhood, probably because it was one of the eldest still standing. It sat on a sizable plot of property, shaded by several large, very old trees. Lush green vines had made their way up most of the walls, covering the brick with dark green leaves, except near the second-floor window on the left side of the house. There, the vines had thinned out and barely grew at all, the color turning a dark shade of brown, where only skeletal vines remained of the once thriving plant. It was as though the plant had witnessed or experienced something that had it never wanting to return, for it was the only part of the front of the house where the brick of the walls was fully exposed. Bare, even. The window had been pushed ajar. It jutted outward at an awkward angle, and bowed as though it had spent years weathering the elements. By the looks of it, it might have done just that. The wood was splintered and the paint peeling, the color a putrid gray, as though the wood beneath had long begun to rot. A stark contrast to the upkept nature of the rest of the house and the other windows that were all painted a bright, clean white. Taking the single step on the stoop, it suddenly occurred to me how odd it felt to be standing at Stephen's front door. Though I had seen his house from a distance several times, this was the closest I had ever been. Stephen had always met us at the fence that lined this property, or we had met at the tree fort, but in all the years I had known him, I had never been inside his house. I had just shifted the books in my still bandaged hands and was contemplating the inevitable knocking I was going to have to do on the door when, to my relief, it swung open. Stephen smiled at me by way of greeting and stepped aside. Unlike its well-kept and manicured exterior, the interior of the house was more antique and unkept. The floors were made of a deep wood that creaked beneath my feet. The walls were covered in dark wallpaper that had begun to peel in the corners of the room. Upon the walls were old paintings and photos, each labeled with a little engraved metallic nameplate. Names of the works of art, their artists, or names of the likeness in the photo were engraved in neat capitalized letters. On the shelves, a number of knickknacks and trinkets lay displayed in a thin layer of dust with a number of the same nameplates. It felt like an old museum that had been closed and forgotten. I marveled at all of it. Walking so slowly, Stephen turned to see if I was still following. He met my gaze, seeming unimpressed by our surroundings. "What is all this?" I asked him, stopping by a nearby shelf to look at a strange animal inside a jar. "Some of it is my uncle's research. Some of it is a hobby. He collects stuff," Stephen said quietly. "He used to be a historian before—" Stephen cleared his throat. I looked over at him. He was fidgeting, staring at the floor. "Your dad thought he would make a better doctor, I guess." "Right," I replied, quickly moving to catch up with him. Stephen turned and continued walking without another word, and I did my best to match his pace despite my curiosity about the house. We turned a corner and he led me up a steep flight of stairs, then down a long hallway, past a closed door, before turning the corner. A large blue curtain was strung across a doorway to another room. As we passed by, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a large library through the crack between the curtain and the wall. Rows of bookshelves housing old books with peeling covers lined the walls. The corner of the room was charred black, and the window next to this area had been left open, as if to air out the smell, the same window as outside. "It's this one," Stephen said quietly, standing before a doorway further down the hall. His voice, though it had been quiet, had startled me. The charred area of the library felt ominous, and I gave it one last glance before walking towards Stephen. His face was unreadable as I approached, his brown eyes watching me. I stopped before him somewhat nervously, but his eyes didn't leave mine as he motioned for me to enter the room. Stephen's room was not what I had expected, although I suppose I don't know exactly what I would have expected. Maybe shelves of books, or some old trinkets from when he was a boy, forgotten toys that lay dusty on a shelf. But Stephen's room was utterly bare. Aside from a mattress on the floor, an area rug, and a lamp, there was nothing. "You can sit on the bed if you like," Stephen said as he made his way to sit on the area rug next to the mattress. He spread the books I had brought with me on the floor. "You didn't miss much." I slowly took him up on his offer, trying to hide the shock that was more than likely evident on my face. Stephen avoided my gaze, suddenly very caught up in flipping through the pages of the books on the floor. It was awkward sitting on his bed, not only for the obvious reason that the mattress sat on the floor and I didn't know what to do with my legs, but also because I had never been in his house before, in his room, his space. "You can take off your shoes if you want. Make yourself comfortable," he said quietly, still avoiding my gaze. I slid my shoes off awkwardly and sat them at the foot of the bed. Then I crossed my legs and waited expectantly. "I know you want to ask," he breathed. "So ask." "Have you talked to Ash?" Stephen looked up at me slowly. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like relief flickered over his face. He shook his head. "Reese told me what happened. She won't talk about it," he said quietly. I nodded slowly and let my gaze drop to my mismatched socks. I had suspected as much, but the truth didn't make it any easier to swallow. "I'm sure she'll come around. In time," he offered quietly. I nodded again, but didn't look at him. Ash probably hated me. Maybe I deserved it. I didn't believe it. When Raven said those things about my mom, when she threw the paper at me with the story and the pictures, I said quietly. Stephen didn't say anything. He just waited patiently for me to say what I wanted to say. But then my father... It's true. I sighed and met Stephen's gaze for the first time. The worry lines were around his eyes. "People have a funny way of hiding what they're ashamed of," he replied quietly. His gaze dropped, and he began to pick at a stray string in the carpet. "What worries me most is, a lot of what Raven had said about my parents has been true. My mother is having an affair. Global Genesis is sending someone to review my father. Raven said the miners were digging in the wrong place. My father didn't confirm that part, but he looked worried. I think he might be in trouble. I always thought my parents were honest. Now I'm starting to wonder if I know them at all." Stephen had gone still as I spoke. He sighed and laid on his back, with his head closest to me. He stared at the ceiling, and I could tell by the look on his face that whatever he was thinking haunted him. He folded his hands and rested them on his chest. "I don't remember much about my father. I didn't know him like so many others did. At his funeral, people spoke about how he was such a model citizen, a loyal Claverian, charming, quick-witted, a loving father." I listened patiently. Stephen's eyes grew darker as he spoke, his hands clenching tighter. So many people in this town knew him, and yet he had everyone fooled. My father was a terrible man. He wasn't religious or spiritual. I'd like to think having that kind of conscience would have destroyed him, stopped him even. And the only thing he was quick about was the swiftness of his hands when he intended to make contact with my body. "He beat you?" I couldn't hide the incredulousness in my voice. Stephen didn't meet my gaze. His eyes were locked on the ceiling, locked on the memories he was currently reliving in his mind, whenever it pleased him, which was often. I would have preferred the beatings, he said darkly. There are worse things you can do to a person. His eyes met mine. They were darker in color than usual, like the light had drifted far away, taking part of him with it. The only hint of emotion on his otherwise emotionless face. He must have sensed I didn't catch his meaning because he added, "My father found his pleasures in other forms of abuse." His words took a moment to sink in. Then I felt my body stiffen, my breath catch in my chest, and I suddenly felt sick. Stephen's gaze returned to the ceiling, his face still unreadable. My uncle was in from out of town. He arrived a day earlier than expected. Finally saw my father for what he really was. They argued in the library. The argument got heated and turned into a fight. I had never seen my uncle be violent, and I remember watching from the banister as his fist made contact with my father's face over and over again, until his face was bloody and purple. His eyes grew puffy and swollen, until he laid completely still. My uncle panicked. He picked up the phone and paced about the room. The next thing I knew, your father was running up the stairs. My chest tightened more at the mention of my father. Stephen's eyes were still on the ceiling. He was laying very still. My father was dead. Jefferson had hit him one too many times, or maybe once too hard. My uncle sank to the floor when he heard the news. Your father paced for a short while before making his way to the oil lamp on the table next to the armchair. Without any hesitation, he threw it on the body. Stephen went quiet, and I realized at some point in his story I had hugged myself very tightly. My stiff fingers were aching. I loosened a breath I didn't know I was holding and tried to unfurl my arms. When a corpse burns, the heat creates muscle spasms, causing the body to move involuntarily. The smell is something I will never forget. And as your father turned to look at my uncle, who was still crumpled on the floor, he said, "It's what they do to degenerates anyways." Stephen paused again, and I drifted back into the present from his story. Stephen sighed. News was released soon after by your father that mine had died from degeneration, committed suicide. I remember looking at his charred face at the funeral. I found a strange comfort in it. He finally looked as ugly on the outside as he was on the inside. My uncle stayed to look after me. He and your father were already friends, but they were inseparable after that. Jefferson often said sometimes the most important family you have is the one you choose. Nobody ever spoke a word about what really happened. I certainly never did. For the first time in my life, I was free. My father had been such a stain on my younger years. I wasn't sure what parts of me were him and what were mine for quite some time. So when I moved into this room, I left it bare. Stephen went quiet. His hands rested peacefully on his chest, and he looked more peaceful than I'd ever seen him before, like some huge weight had been lifted from him. Hesitantly, I reached my hand out to take his. He let me and met my gaze. The light had returned to his eyes. "I'm sorry," was all I could manage to say. Stephen gave me a weak smile by way of reply. He squeezed my hand gently as he stared up at my face. "I can't say your father's an honest man, but I can attest that he has his reasons for doing things," Stephen said quietly. "Be careful what you go looking for." As you find yourself settling back into this world, I want to take a moment to thank all our listeners for joining me for this Bholla Entertainment production of the Jotted Journal podcast. If you love the show and want to help others find it, feel free to give us a shout out on social media and share our Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Bholla Entertainment. You can check out some of my other content by following me on Instagram or TikTok or subscribing to my YouTube channel at Blake C. Hollaway. See you next week and holla at you soon.